We will record this session. Welcome. Hello for those who are coming. We're very happy to welcome you here. Okay, I think we can start. So hello everyone, welcome. My name is Ana Clara. I'm very happy to be here with you today for our webinar, Migration, Responsibilities and Solidarity. This is a webinar organized by the Transversal Dialogue project called Dialogue, together with Transform Europe and New Humanity. This project is funded by the European Union, and it's part of a wider project called Project Dialogue. Quelli che vogliono sentire in italiano potete anche scegliere la interpretazione sotto l'icona del globo. So those who want to listen also in Italian, we have Italian translations. This wider dialogue project, it's a project that puts together diverse identities allied, open to generate a united world. The project is promoted by a consortium of 14 CSOs from 9 EU member states. The Dialogue project fosters the immersion of cross-cutting dimensions of identity, overcoming national boundaries, contributing to the building of EU citizenship. And the Dialogue project is composed by 4 bilateral dialogue groups. And today, this is a webinar that the group of dialogue among Christians and non-confessional citizens, atheists and Marxists, will come together to discuss the topic on migration. And since this is a EU-funded project, we need to have some ways to evaluate the work that we have been doing. So I ask you either to scan the QR code or to click the link on the chat that I will send right now. So you can either scan the QR code or click on the link I sent on the chat and answer the questionnaire. You can choose also the language of the questionnaire. There are options to answering this in English, German, and Italian. In the first page of the questionnaire, you can choose the language you want to answer it. If you are following our webinar through a computer, I suggest you to answer the questionnaire via the link that I sent you now. We will give you some minutes to answer the questionnaire. It's very important for us so we can evaluate the work that we are doing. This is a pre-questionnaire, pre-webinar questionnaire. And then at the beginning of our session tomorrow, we will have another questionnaire. So we will give you some minutes to answer it, and then we will continue our webinar. Thank you so much for being here. We are very happy with your presence. If anyone has any questions or difficulties on answering the questionnaire, you can write on the chat. We will give you some minutes to answer it, and after that, we will start our webinar.
Recording in progress.
Okay, for those who entered, we are giving some minutes just to fill up the webinar. But I think in 2 more minutes we can start. I can ask Jose Manuel to take the word after me. For those who just entered, we're taking the time to answer the questionnaire, but I think Jose Manuel, you can start now. Jose Manuel,
Yeah, sorry.
the floor is yours. You
Thank you.
start. Thank
I
you.
was just receiving my food because I have not lunched, so sorry for this. Well, it's a pleasure and also an honor to welcome you all to this seminar, to this webinar on migration responsibilities. My name is José Manuel Pureza, a Portuguese citizen, and I teach at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And I'm also a member of the coordination team of Dialog, the platform of dialogue between Christians and Marxists, which has been formed around 2014, and which has been developing different dynamics of dialogue between people from the two, say, cultural traditions, Marxism and Christianity. And I was, reminding the words of the Pope. The Pope has conceived an audience in the last January the 10th to a delegation from Dialog, which has been a privilege, absolute privilege for all of us who've been there. And in that audience, the Pope challenged all of us to don't quit our efforts before difficult tasks, and has also emphasized the need for people to be committed with a fair and just transformation of reality. And to that purpose, for that purpose, the Pope used the expression social poets. We need to be social poets. And I think that these words from Pope Francis are quite inspiring in a moment in which we start our debate about migration and responsibilities. In fact, what we want to do is to not only analyze in a cold manner the reality of migration, but namely to know that reality in order to transform it in a fair and just way. So for that purpose, we need not only to understand the causes, to understand the relations of power that are enshrined in that are embodied in the reality of massive fluxes of migration, namely towards Europe, but we also need to be aware of the responsibilities, the objective and not only subjective responsibilities that are present in this reality. So we very much want this webinar to be able to identify policies, structures, actors that have a condition of power, political, economic, cultural, whatever, and that contribute with their way of living and their way of deciding, that contributes to this tremendous and horrendous situation of people fleeing from their homes, fleeing from their countries, and searching and putting their lives in danger to reach a better a better condition. So this is what this seminar is all about. We want to discuss the reality of migration fluxes, the reality of massive migration fluxes, but namely we want to know this in order to contribute with our exercises of dialogue between activists, academics, scholars, journalists, common citizens, to contribute with gathering all these people to transform this situation. So this was I think the introduction needed for this exercise, and I will now give the floor to Judith Kohlenberg to talk with us about EU policies on migration, the actuality of this topic and of these debates. Judith is an affiliated researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Politics and a cultural scientist on migration and migration researcher, at the Institute for Social Policy at Vienna, where she researches and teaches refugee migration, integration, and belonging. And I very much would like to welcome Judith and to thank her for being available to enrich us with her reflection. So the floor is yours, Judith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk to you about migration asylum policy on the EU level. I would very much like to endorse what you just said as an introductory statement. I think it's very important to look at the reality on the ground, but also look at the policies that exist and that can be changed. And I think that's very important. So what I am trying to do in my initial input here is to give you an overview, a kind of tour de force of the current EU migration asylum policies that there are, but also look at potentials for change, look at potentials of further development as we go along. I will try to share my slides. I hope this works. Can you all see that now? If it's working?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that is great. That is great. So let me just start with some recent developments at the EU migration policy level. And really it starts in 2020 when we not only had, as you all probably very well know, the big fire at the refugee camp Moria at Lesbos, which it's still not quite clear how and why the fire was started. But what was clear is that Moria was a camp originally designed as part of the EU hotspot system for around 3,000 people. And at a point in time when the fire broke out during the first year of the pandemic, it hosted about 12,000 people, most of whom had to live in tents with little to no protection from the weather, the environment, and so on. So that was around at the same time when the EU Commission presented its new pact on migration, the so-called EU Migration Pact, with really a wealth of proposals of how to, in their view, ameliorate the situation, of how to bring about, as Commission President von der Leyen said, a fresh start. And interestingly enough, many references to Moria were made in this initial press conference when the pact and its key parameters were presented. So the EU Commissioner for the Interior, Ylva Johansson, decidedly said this pact is designed exactly in order to prevent more of Morias to happen. So what would happen in Moria, this overburdening of the system, the fact that basic human needs could no longer be met for the many thousands of refugees hosted there, and finally the fire that broke out, we want to prevent this in the future. So really the motto was no more Morias, and we'll later discuss whether that is indeed the fact or is true when we look at the proposals in the pact. Now, fast forward a few years, because what happened between 2020 and 2023 was there were a lot of negotiations on the pact. There was a lot of sort of strategic positioning by the member states. We had, in particular, as regards to Visegrad states, Poland, Hungary, and others, which decidedly said we do not endorse this pact at all, and we do not share any of the proposals enshrined in there. But of course, on the other hand, there was also much opposition happening from humanitarian organizations and NGOs working on the ground, who said that this EU migration pact means overall more restrictive asylum rules for the EU. Fast forward to June 2023, when we had a first decisive step towards a decision, when the EU ministers of the interior met in Luxembourg, and they did reach an agreement on the key pillars of the pact. They reached this agreement with qualified majority, so not all the member states agreed on it, but most of them did. And this was a decisive moment because this meant that the EU could move things forward as concerns the key ideas in the pact. And I will just later on talk about what the main pillars are. In summer, then also what happened at the same time, because the arrivals across the Mediterranean increased and also deaths in the Mediterranean increased massively. The situation in Lampedusa became more and more of a spotlight again. So what happened was that the EU tried to strike a deal with Tunisia. Another example of the ongoing externalization trend on the EU level. So we had Commission President von der Leyen and the Prime Ministers of Italy and the Netherlands who went to Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, and agreed on strengthening a strategic partnership with the country. So the idea was that the EU should pay overall $1 billion for a variety of measures, also economic measures, but mainly in order to prevent so-called irregular or illegal, as they even called it, migration, with a view to reducing arrivals via boat across the Mediterranean. This happened at the same time while we had ongoing negotiations about the other key aspects of the pact. As you all know, probably, what happened over the summer last year was actually the exact opposite. Also, we had this quite prestigious meeting of high-level officials and high-level politicians, and both sides agreed on this partnership. Arrivals across the Mediterranean did not decrease, but actually increased over the summer, which is a kind of paradoxical effect of migration policy that has been shown again and again in studies. Namely, that when you proclaim something that you want to do something, so if you announce that a policy is soon going to be put into place, this means that, of course, you're giving migrants, but you're also giving smugglers some leeway and some time to react to that. And they actually use this kind of announcement to promote the sort of passing of the Mediterranean right now, sooner than later. So we saw a kind of now or never upturn in crossings of the Mediterranean. And also we saw much more deaths this summer than happened the years before that. So there was a kind of paradoxical, contradictory effect of this intended agreement with Tunisia. I say intended because what also became clear in late summer was that Tunisia all of a sudden seemed less interested in striking the deal. They voiced some concerns that this was not a partnership on an equal footing. And in particular, they said they don't want to do border policing for the EU, because this is what it all boils down to when we look at sort of the main intention for this partnership from the EU side. Then over the fall of last year again, negotiations continued, and then a final breakthrough, in inverted commas, was reached in December last year in Brussels in some overnight negotiations that took more than 24 hours. But after that, in a trialogue, so the EU Commission, the Council and the Parliament did agree on the key components of the asylum reform. So the common European asylum system was to be reformed in the key ways in which it was proposed in the EU Migration Pact. And most notably, and this was something that was mediatized heavily, this agreement could only be reached because you know that it has to be a unanimous decision. So all the member states had to agree, and Hungary notoriously said it will not agree on burden sharing, on sharing within the asylum responsibility of the EU. So what they did was they waited for Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, to leave the room and then to take the vote so it could be passed. And what we're now looking ahead to is a vote in the plenary session of the European Parliament. This is supposed to happen in April this year, when there will be, I think, several critical and oppositional voices be heard, because we know that several fractions in the European Parliament are still very critical of the reform, but overall it is to be expected to be passed. So what we will see right before the elections to the European Parliament in June is that the key pillars of this reform will be passed. Then, of course, it's up to the next legislative period to put these into practice. So what actually was agreed on? What are some of the key components of this reform? First of all, I want to start by saying that this is a highly complex legal matter, and I feel like not even some of the people working on all the details of this are familiar with how, or know at this point how it should be implemented. So a big point of criticism is not only that overall asylum regulations in the EU will become more restrictive, it will become more difficult for some groups of people to seek asylum in Europe, but also it will be very tricky to implement all these complex regulations into the individual national legal systems and on the ground. So this is also a very big point of criticism from the side of experts. First of all, the member states and the EU Commission and Parliament agreed on border procedures. Border procedures, I think, do not even deserve the term procedure, because they are not procedures decidedly, but they are sort of rapid screenings that have to happen within 12 weeks, so 3 months, for those people who come from countries with a historically low acceptance rate, and this rate was set at 20%, lower than 20%. So let me just take one example. For instance, if a Pakistani national arrives on EU territory, he or she would qualify for this border procedure, because in most EU member states, Pakistani citizens historically had an acceptance rate lower than 20%. And this means that this person will not immediately get access to a fair actual asylum procedure, but rather, first of all, be submitted to this border procedure, where it's decided whether he or she will indeed be able to receive an actual asylum procedure and be heard in front of a court and get fair treatment, be heard all of his grounds and so on. So what will happen then in the border procedure is a kind of rapid decision that will be made. And in many cases, as we know also from pilot projects that have already been carried out, mostly in the EU member states with external borders, we know that in border procedures, you have very high rejection rates. So most individuals who are streamlined into this border procedure track will be rejected and will have to leave EU territory again without being able to officially make their asylum claim heard. The only exception that the EU member states agreed on are unaccompanied minors. They will immediately, all of them, regardless of nationality, get access to an actual asylum procedure. Germany very much argued for an exception for all families arriving, but most other member states disagreed. So it's only unaccompanied minors. And what actually some experts say, and I would confer with that, is that this carries a higher risk of actually the smuggling industry responding to this and, focusing even more on unaccompanied minors, promoting this as kind of the only way for a whole family to get access to the EU, so that we will see an increase in unaccompanied minors making the journey. So this is again something that should be prevented by the EU rather than even promoted by sort of contradictory policies here. Another key pillar in this reform is asylum centers that are to be established in member states with external borders, mainly Italy, Greece, Spain. Now, if that sounds familiar, yes, it is familiar. And for many experts, and I would include myself, it's not quite clear how that would actually mean a massive change from the current system. This is basically the hotspot system that we've seen in recent years all over again. And it's not clear how this would share or spread the burden, so to say, equally, or take away some of the pressure from the member states with external borders. Because in practice, what we can expect very soon to happen is that people who underwent the border procedure but were rejected, many of them will not return voluntarily to their home countries. And in many cases, the home countries might not even be interested in taking them back. So there will be sort of a backlog happening soon. The same happened in Moria, for instance. So even if these asylum centers are initially well-structured, good sanitation systems, good sort of overall facility management and so on, it can mean in practice that very soon, over a very short period of time, there will be more and more people filling up these centers. And again, there's a high risk of sort of creating informal lodgings, tents around these official centers, because people can't be deported on the one hand, but also people in many cases will be rejected and are not allowed to officially enter EU territory. So this idea of restricting mobility is one of the key points of criticisms from humanitarian organizations, that during this period of 12 weeks, EU member states are allowed to restrict the mobility of arriving migrants. So yes, they can voluntarily return and go back, but they are not allowed to move further into EU territory. And this, some say, is like being forced into sort of a kind of imprisonment-like situation. And of course, asylum centers are not supposed to be prisons. So this idea of fictional non-entry is what the legal term is here. Another key aspect, and this was the main reason why Viktor Orban had to leave the room, is because the member states agreed on mandatory solidarity with flexibility. If that sounds like kind of oxymoron and a contradiction in of itself, I think it really is, because the idea behind this mandatory solidarity is that the member states all have to share in some way in this asylum burden. Every member state has to do its part, but they get to choose in which way they want to participate. So it's mandatory, but it's also flexible in a way. So member states can either opt to host refugees themselves, also relocate refugees from other member states. They can also decide to contribute financially to other member states. And there was even a price that the member states found that should be allocated per refugee, which is 20,000 euros. Or member states can also opt to engage in alternative measures. So for instance, to support deployment of personnel, to support deportations, to provide support for capacity building in other member states and so on. So there is a whole wealth really of options that you can choose from. Still, as I said, some member states like Hungary said that none of these options will do. We will not participate in any shape, way or form in supporting the EU asylum system, because we simply do not want to accept any kind of asylum seekers. And finally, what was also agreed on, and this I find somewhat funny, funny might be the wrong word, but somewhat absurd in this context, that the EU member states agreed to enforce deportations of rejected asylum seekers, but they agreed that amongst themselves, but did not include the countries of origin. And of course, they play a key role when it comes to returning people whose asylum claim was rejected. So even if the EU member states agree on this, the key partners they should talk with and include in this decision are, of course, the home countries and the transit countries, and they were not even part of these negotiations. So I think this is really just an expression of a political will, but how this will be put into practice is really another question. Another key aspect of this new reform is the so-called crisis regulation. This also brought about huge discussions and many negotiations among the member states. The idea is that member states can impose exceptional measures when a crisis situation appears. And a crisis situation is basically when a particularly high number of migrants arrive in a given member state. Initially, the idea was that each and every member state can decide on its own whether this is now a crisis or not, which I think would have really meant a complete overhaul of the system, because we know that crisis talk has also become a strategic weapon in the political arena. Now I think there was some kind of a better situation reached that only a qualified majority of all member states can actually decide that a crisis is in fact occurring. For instance, also this can be applied to the so-called instrumentalization of migrants, or as some political actors call it, I do not like the term, but just for reference, a hybrid warfare by sending migrants, by sending vulnerable people to the EU border. And this is something we've seen over the last couple of years, really starting in late 2021 at the Polish-Belarusian border, where we now know for a fact that already by that point, it was really Vladimir Putin behind that, aiming to destabilize Europe by sending migrants there. But also, it's not only about high arrivals at land borders, but also sea borders. So it can also be applied to search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean, for instance, by NGOs. So if there is a high number of rescued migrants and a high number of NGO boats that arrive on the shore, then this can also be classified as a crisis situation. And given member states can say, we actually further restrict mobility of migrants in the border procedures, and we actually subject all migrants, and this is the key aspect in this crisis regulation, we subject all arriving migrants to the border procedures. So there are really no exceptions here. Again, the only exception is unaccompanied minors. But in this crisis regulation, it would mean that the nationality of the arriving migrant is completely irrelevant, and everyone who arrives is subjected to quick border procedures. And overall, this would just really mean undermining existing asylum regulations as we've known it for decades. Meanwhile, what happened meanwhile? I think it's important not only to look at what the EU decided and wants to do, but also what happened on the ground, and really literally on the ground, I'm afraid. Because at the same time, when the EU was discussing becoming more restrictive towards arriving migrants, we saw one of the hugest shipwrecks over the last decades, really. In June 2023, we had this shipwreck with about 500 to 700 passengers that drowned off the coast of Pylos. It's yet unclear what the role of the Greek Coast Guard was and in how far they were immediately involved, maybe even immediately responsible for the shipwreck to happen. What we've also seen over the last couple of years is illegal pushbacks becoming an integral part of the asylum system. So when people say border control, what they mean, its end really is pushbacks, because it's the only way how you can control borders if migrants try to cross it, but are supposed to be kept from crossing borders by border guards. And this means the border guards have to engage in illegal pushbacks. In many cases, not always, but in most cases, this also means violence, so becoming physically violent. And we know for a fact now, and there has been more and more evidence surfacing, empirical evidence by journalists, by researchers, and so on, that pushbacks happen, I want to say, on a daily basis across the Balkan route. They happen also, and there's just recent evidence between Germany and Austria. They happen in the Mediterranean. In last summer, a video surfaced by an Austrian refugee helper that documented how the Greek Coast Guard picks up people who already arrived on the Greek mainland, and those were mostly women and children, and transfers them back onto little dingies in the Mediterranean. Yeah? So this is sort of the textbook definition, I want to say, of pushbacks. And we also know for a fact that this very Greek Coast Guard is partially funded by EU money. What we also have is now that in some member states, the asylum system has virtually been abolished, but this has so far led to no consequences for these member states. The prime example, again, being Hungary. There are now several rulings by the European Court of Justice stating clearly that Hungary violates EU law because its asylum rules are too strict. In fact, Hungary only accepted, I think, about 10 or so asylum applications over the last year, which is utterly absurd considering that its immediate neighbor, Austria, accepted in the same year more than 100,000 asylum applications. But even though we have these rulings by the European Court of Justice, nothing has happened. Hungary still receives funding by the EU. No sanctions have been put into place. And I think what this also means is negative consequences for the remaining member states which fulfill their asylum duty. So there are still member states who try to uphold rule of law also in the asylum system. But of course, the system becomes increasingly unfair if more and more member states opt out of it, so to say. And what we see now, or have been seeing over the last couple of years, is a race to the bottom. More and more member states joining this race to the bottom, which means that the system becomes even more unfair for the remaining member states. And then finally, and this is, I would say, one of the big trends, and trends in inverted commas really, externalization. The London High Court ruled that externalization to Rwanda is illegal. It's not a safe country because there are huge deficiencies in the asylum system there. Nonetheless, not only the UK government is trying to find ways of making this legal and of actually getting legal approval also by the High Court, even the German government is now very, very seriously exploring options of externalizing to Rwanda. And I think we all know what this means if Germany will start externalizing. So I think this is something to really keenly watch in the future, this trend towards externalization. And of course, also, so to a somewhat lesser degree, we could also look at the recent Italy-Albania agreement that has been reached, which is also an example of externalizing asylum responsibility. And we will see how this actually will affect asylum rules and protection for vulnerable people. Further trends also, so externalization I mentioned, I would say also on the level of rhetoric, a really new and very hard discourse happening by politicians, also by politicians who are not part of sort of the right-wing spectrum, but really would define themselves as center or even left to the center. Very strong and harsh rhetoric, and we all know that rhetoric again influences the policies made and influences votes very much. So this is something to be watched. The race to the bottom I mentioned. Something that I think we should also watch very keenly is trends towards datafication, artificial intelligence, and digital border management. Very much already being used at the US-Mexican border, where, for instance, migrants arriving from Mexico have to lodge their asylum claim via an app on their phone, which comes with huge racial biases, as we all know, all of these apps do. So for instance, people have to scan their faces, but the app, because of the inbuilt racial bias, is not really good at detecting brown and black faces. So this means that many people are at a disadvantage for actually getting a spot in the asylum system. And of course, within these informal lodgings on the US-Mexican border, many of them don't have stable Wi-Fi connection, etc., etc. So this comes with huge, huge problems, really. But I think this is an overall trend that we will very soon also see in the EU. And then another trend that seems anachronistic, because I just talked about new technologies and AI, and now I'm talking about walls and fences, which sounds like we're back in the Middle Ages. But indeed, we now have many more walls and fortification worldwide than we did during the Cold War. So border walls have been on the increase, although research is very clear here that walls do not keep people from migrating. It only means that people have to opt for even more dangerous routes and have to find a way to circumvent borders. But nonetheless, more and more countries opt for these. And just yesterday, I think, the EU Parliament barely rejected a proposition to use EU funds to support member states in building walls or fences. This was rejected, but only by a very small majority in the EU Parliament. So what can we do now? What can scholars and policy analysts contribute to the debate, and how can we change this or turn this around? So something that sounds very banal in times like these, but I still believe in this. And I think it's still very important to present empirical facts. So I just mentioned, for instance, that most of studies that I'm familiar with very clearly show that walls and fences do not keep people from migrating. And this is a very sort of banal fact, but it's still important to present this to the public and to policymakers, to politicians, and to state clearly what the empirical evidence is, especially in times like these, where we see an increased discrepancy between the rhetoric on the one hand and the reality on the other hand. So there is this huge discrepancy, and this has to be addressed, I think, by scholars, by policy analysts. I also think it's very important to expose narratives, to expose constructed imagery. I'm thinking of Lampedusa as a chronic crisis. I'm thinking of pictures of overburdened systems, overburdened asylum centers, asylum seekers only being young single men, where we know that we have increasing numbers of women and children, but they are not presented in media. This whole notion of if climate change increases, then there will be an African storm towards Europe. And this is sometimes even used by climate activists as an argument, which I find very, very dangerous, because it pits really one humanitarian crisis against the other. So I think really to expose frames and narratives is key. It's important to contextualize and contrast, to look at numbers. One fact that I repeat again and again, because I think it's so important, the large majority of migration to Europe is regular migration, labor migration, people responding to increased labor needs, and only a very small percentage is so-called irregular migration, forced migration. But the way we look at it is we scandalize this small percentage and blow it up in huge proportions. And then, of course, the public gets the impression that this is a problem that has run out of hands, that cannot be managed. And I think this is also an issue. Also, something we can do is, I think, to point to open weaknesses, to questions and loose ends. And I think there are several of these loose ends in the reform as it stands now. So many things, many details seem unclear. It's unclear how they are to be implemented, or how actually this will sustainably change and optimize the system, not only for arriving migrants, but also for the member states and host countries. It's not clear how that will, over time, really ameliorate the situation. And then, of course, I think it's important to overall contribute to these debates, but also by contributing to suggest alternatives. So not only stop by criticizing what is proposed now, but really I see it as important in this day and age for scholars and within a critical policy discourse to also present innovations, a new perspective, to also try to show how different systems can be possible and how they can move from being just a vision to being put into action. And there, I think we can very well start at the local level, because a lot of things are working on the local level, as we know, city to city arrivals and so on, but also these can be moved up to a higher level and also maybe become models for international cooperation too. So with this, I would like to sort of lead into discussion by some questions or things to consider. I think that overall, especially when we look at the role of scholarship, the role of policy analysis, there's a high risk of political instrumentalization from all sides, really. And also there is such a high demand for definite answers that sometimes we run the risk of undermining the complexity. And it's really important to me to say that this is a complex issue, and there are also some hard truths that come with it. One hard truth, for instance, there will also be a certain percentage of irregular migration. You know, we cannot completely regularize the system, even if we do create more legal pathways, more safe pathways, but there will always be a certain percentage. So what will this mean for the concept of the nation state and so on? There are certain dilemmas within the policy field. There are certain conflict of goals, and I think we have to be transparent of those. Then, of course, it's a question of time and resources for scholarship overall, I would say, but also the question of what is impact and how much impact is possible. So what actually counts as impact? Impact is a contribution to the debate already enough of an impact, or should we just aim really for actual policy change? And how frustrating does this become if we do not see this policy change right away? And then, of course, the stakeholders are important to consider, I think, EU stakeholders, but also very much on the regional and local level. I think this is often overlooked, but here, in my experience, you can find a high level of cooperation because people realize on the local levels, it's not so important what the overall ideology is, the discourse is, it's important that things work. And so because everyone is interested in things working out, people tend to be more cooperative in my experience. So it's really worthwhile to also look at regional, local level. And then, of course, a big question, and maybe this is something also that towards the end we can also discuss, how do you navigate between the demands of being sort of a distant scholar, but also being publicly engaged, which I think we all are in this group here. This is important to consider, or to actually be just aware of a different, of the risk of instrumentalization, as I said, but also be aware of what can be achieved by scholarship, what can be achieved by actively entering a public debate. And we have similar discussions going on when it comes to the climate crisis, scholars researching the climate crisis, but also taking a very decided stance, saying that not only do we want to present our scientific results, we also want to see these results put into practice. And I think here we see clearly, this is something that Andrew Hoffman coined in his book, this notion of being an engaged scholar, which I very much feel is also present in this arena here. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to any questions or comments you might have, and of course to an inspiring discussion. So thank you very much again for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Judith. It was what a fantastic way of starting out today. It was really great. So thank you very much for your extremely inspiring, insightful statements and the data that the different elements of your reflection that you have shared with us. So thank you so much. I think that we now move to the question and answer part. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for that purpose. So I just would like all the participants to show their interest in raising questions or making comments, or just for clarifying something that you have not really understood in the rigorous way. So yeah, go ahead. Those of you that want to participate at this moment in the question and answers period.
People can share their questions on the chat.
On the chat, that's right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There is a first comment here, I suppose. Let me just check. Yeah, on the chat, which says something like, sorry. EU needs something, EU needs work. How can it be matched with migration? Oh yeah, EU needs workforce, I suppose. How can it be matched with migration and
Education.
And education, that's right. Then the second one also in the chat is there a difference between the EU asylum and the EU migration pact? Something that was in the first slide that you presented, Judith. And the third question also in the chat is, thank you very much, Dr. Judith, because you pointed out the narrative to the public and the mood in the political will, one that I guess we should address to the public. So it's not a question, but it is a sort of comment to which you also can react. So perhaps Judith could start with these three suggestions, and then we'll move to the other people.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I will start with the first question, the EU workforce. And I would like to thank you for this question, because I think this points at a key policy dilemma, really. I just recently published a policy brief on this, and I can happily also share this with all of you after this event. I think here we increasingly see a kind of contradiction that is happening. We have two narratives that, when you come to think about them closely, are in contradiction. And the one narrative, now really formulated to the extreme, is the whole world wants to come to Europe. Everyone wants to come here, so we have to stop them. We have to build fences and walls. We have to make sure that no one comes in. So this is kind of the Fortress Europe narrative that becomes increasingly loud, I would say. On the other hand, however, we also have a kind of narrative, and this is very much present in Germany, for instance, that says, ooh, we need workforce, and we now have the problem that Europe is no longer among the most attractive regions of the world for migrants from abroad. So we have the problem that no one wants to come. How do we attract people? You know, and if we come to think of it, this is, of course, a contradiction. And now people who say, well, we want the right migrants to come, but the wrong ones to stay out, I think this is just a distinction that doesn't hold in reality, and that also is really much not supported by labor market data, because what we know, this is actually something also that the Commissioner Magritte-Schinas wrote in a recent op-ed, it's not so much the rocket scientists that Europe needs, he wrote, but it's much more the lorry drivers and the cleaning staff and the service personnel. So it's not academics that we're mainly looking for, it's the low and middle qualified jobs that are direly missing the workforce. And so I think this will become increasingly an issue in the next couple of years, that we have two different really policy aims here. And I think this demographic change that is already underway in Europe will just pick up force in the next couple of years. So I do think there needs to be something done. What the EU now proposed, first of all, for this kind of matching is a so-called talent pool, which works, and these are not my words, but this is what Commissioner Johansson said. She said it works like Tinder for jobs. So you have an app on your phone, and then migrants from third countries can find matching jobs. Now, of course, this is, as you can imagine, quite high threshold, I think. It's not clear what the results will be for most countries. And overall, we are just lacking legal and more and different legal pathways into Europe, also for labor migrants, because the reality is that for many people in most African countries, actually, it's virtually impossible to get a work visa for Europe. It's very costly, actually, for many people to apply in the first place. And then it takes quite long for them to get a visa notification, if they get one at all. So this is really much of an issue, and I think much more needs to be done if we do not want to decrease economic productivity also in Europe. So for matching, I think, yes, there are little policy initiatives like the EU talent pool. There are also skills partnerships and so on. But overall, I think there needs to be done more. And now, of course, this will be the task of the next commission that comes into place, I would say. There was also a second question, the difference between the Asylum and Migration Pact. So the pact as such was called the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. So in one sort of framework. Overall, the pact does not really include labor migration. So it mainly means irregular migration, forced migration and asylum. For labor migration, we have not seen so many propositions. And I think behind this is an overall political issue that I see, because irregular migration, as the EU calls it, and asylum is seen as an issue for the ministers of the interior. So when they meet, they're discussing this, but of course, the sort of the glasses that they are wearing, the perspective that they are adopting is one of security. So migration is seen as a security issue, not for vulnerable people on the move, but rather for the host countries. The problem is, however, that migration, in my point of view, should be discussed by the ministers for social affairs, by economic ministers, by justice ministers, and so on, but they never talk about this. And so this, from the start, really puts the whole narrative into a corner where it does not belong, or at least does not belong exclusively. And so as long as we do not change that, also sort of who is responsible to suggest what kind of policies in the individual member states, but also on EU level, I think as long as this is not resolved, we will not see a lot of movement into the right direction.
I think there is another question that has been raised, I believe it was by Katerina, just now, a few moments ago in the chat. Let me just move to it. And it is the following. Dear Judith, it seems that there is quite prominent trend development with bilateral agreements with countries in Asia and Latin America. For example, Greece has such agreements with 6 countries like Vietnam and India. Germany struck a deal with Vietnam also past January. And the question is, do you see a general trend here? And the second question, do the EU institutions spend any time connecting migration fluxes to EU foreign policy and EU extractivist businesses? The so-called, Fluchtursachen. I'm not a German speaker, so sorry for this.
Yeah, the root causes of migration. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Those are 2 very, very poignant questions. So first question, yes, I do see a general trend that has been going on for the last couple of years, really, that we see more and more bilateral agreements between an individual member state of the EU and a third country that, of course, when it becomes a general trend, starts to undermine the overall EU kind of cooperation that should happen. So I think one reason why it was really important for the EU to at least present this partnership with Tunisia was also because, with an eye to the elections happening in June, it was very much high time for the EU to finally also present some sort of success. Because for the lack of success that we've seen over the last couple of years, this has meant that individual member states said, well, this is going too slow, the EU does not work, so we want to have bilateral agreements, which also means that the individual heads of state can then say to their own population, well, see, we're doing something, and this is actually moving forward because we now have these bilateral agreements. But I think overall they have a high risk really of undermining EU cooperation, international cooperation. And of course, it also means in these bilateral agreements, I mean, I think there are several countries by now in the EU that have a bilateral agreement with, for instance, Morocco on returns. But there is again a discrepancy between having an agreement on paper and actually returning rejected asylum seekers to Morocco. We know that there is a huge gap between these 2 things. So very often it's also very much about flexing your political muscle, showing that you as the head of state are actually moving things forward, having good photo ops, but what is then happening very soon moves out of the overall media presence that we have. And this is a problem because then people get frustrated. They feel like we talk about this all the time, you present solution after solution, but nothing changes, and we do not feel that something changes. And so again, I would be very critical of that trend actually, but I do agree it is one. So yeah, very poignant question. And then at the sort of the root causes of migration, well, yes, indeed, there is so much in this whole thing because on the one hand, of course, we are constantly, and we, and now mean as the European Union, constantly producing more and more root causes of migration by the economic system that we tend to uphold, by the way we still engage in climate pollution and do little to mitigate it, and so on and so forth. So of course we are producing more reasons for people to migrate. Our security policy in the global south tends to produce more and more reasons to migrate, and even more so, I think, and this is something that in my opinion, is not seen by most political actors by now, is that by engaging in this increasing trend in externalization to third countries, this undermines EU's position as a regulatory superpower in the world. The idea that in Europe, we do value human rights, we value individual rights and freedoms, And historically, these have been very important also for our partner countries. So for instance, development cooperation with, let's say, African countries was usually tied to, you have to stick to your rule of law, human rights. But what we're now doing, and this is kind of a double standard, we're saying on the one hand, yes, human rights, really important, but maybe not so much when it comes to asylum. But because here we like to undermine our own rules and our own, Geneva Convention and so on, by externalizing, by behaving as we behave at the Polish border, by doing what we do in the Mediterranean and so on. And so it's easy really for illiberal democracies, for authoritarian states around the world to point to this discrepancy and to say, well, yes, on the one hand, Europe says, look at us, human rights leader, but when really push comes to shove, we do not stand by this, and sort of we differentiate between different groups of people. We know for a fact that Vladimir Putin argues around this in Russia, right? This is part of the Russian propaganda saying, the whole European discourse on human rights is actually fake, because let me show you in practice, I will send migrants to the Finnish border or the Polish border, and then let's see what the EU does. And of course, the EU reacts exactly like Putin expects them to react, and scandalizes the whole situation. Or in Poland, for instance, we undermined the right to asylum and the non-refoulement principle, that is a key pillar of asylum law, was briefly taken out was no longer seen as active, and pushbacks were more or less legalized, also with backing by the EU, just by making sure, or the goal was just to make sure that Poland didn't have to accept, I think, a few dozen migrants. And so this is really, I think, a key security issue for Europe, because it undermines credibility. It undermines our regulatory stance in the world, and really gives illiberal powers and authoritarian states in the world much resource and material to argue against what liberal democracies stand for.
Well, thank you so much. I think that we have still 5 minutes, more or less. So perhaps this last question that has been raised by someone at the chat, Candela Cacoparoni Caballo. If I understood well, a person who has a residency permit in a country of the EU is not necessarily free to enter another member country. How does it come? What does it depend on?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question.
I'm
sorry. Someone who has a resident permit in one member state in the EU?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it is written. I don't know if the person who has written that question can explain a little bit better. I don't know.
I'm sorry, if maybe I can also, I'm happy also to share the slides and put my contact details in the chat if you want to follow up. Maybe I'm sorry, I just did not understand the question, but yeah.
There is another one, and the final one. I think that we will stop here. Which is the following one. Can you expand on instrumentalization? What has been the response of the European left to recent trends? Is it unified and visible? What kind of influence do you think churches have on EU policy concerning this aspect, of course? Yeah. So instrumentalization and the role of churches.
Yeah. I'm afraid I can't say too much about the influence of churches. I mean, I do know that really depending on how much the church overall has influence in a given member state, they can influence the discourse around migration, refugees quite dramatically in some ways. I think they still have very much of this moral authority, and that is important in these days. But for instrumentalization, the overall idea is really that migrants, vulnerable people on the move, are used mostly by authoritarian states as sort of, I don't like the term, but this is how it's framed, as weapons by sending them to the border of an EU country. And what we've seen this, for instance, also on the part of Turkey, where it's even more absurd because these weapons that are people were given to Turkey by the EU in the first place, right? It was part of the EU-Turkey deal that about 4 million Syrian refugees were hosted in Turkey, and for this the EU paid about 9 billion euros altogether. But then again, someone like Erdogan very well knew that if he needs to up the pressure in whatever diplomatic negotiation he is conducting with the EU, he can just threaten to send all these migrants to the EU, because he knows for a fact that the EU is quite afraid of all these migrants arriving. And so this has been happening time and again, that Erdogan literally carried dozens of these people to, for instance, the river Evros, which is the border between Turkey and Greece, and threatened EU leaders with this again and again. And this is sort of what we mean when we say instrumentalization. And the discourse very much then focuses on what Turkey wants and what the EU wants, but hardly anyone really looks at those who are instrumentalized, which are vulnerable people, migrants, refugee seekers. In the Polish-Belarusian case, we know that dozens of them were stranded in between two countries. They couldn't go forward to Poland, they couldn't go back to Belarus or leave the countries. Several people died. It was also kind of a media black box because neither journalists nor humanitarian organizations were let into this field. And so we didn't even know what was happening. And to make matters even more absurd, only a few weeks later, the big Ukrainian displacement happened, and at a different Polish border, these people were welcomed with open arms, which I think was good and right and important to do. But we also had Syrian migrants, families arriving who were not let into the EU territory. And I think this is also really a problem because this also gives third countries and countries in the global south much material to argue that the EU upholds double standards. And this also increases, as we're seeing now with regards to other geopolitical conflicts, really just increases polarization, also, in the Muslim world and so on. So I think this is a huge issue and really goes to show how much at the center point of current security and geopolitical discussions, migration and asylum law is.
Well, thank you very much, Judith, for your contribution to the excellent start we had in this webinar. It has been a splendid way of starting this reflection. So thank you very much. And I think that we are in a condition to move to Professor Shahram Khosravi, is it?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to present you Braden Willenberg, who is the Anglican Refugee Support Lead for a joint partnership between the diocese in Europe, the Diocese of Canterbury, and Brandon has experience in working alongside refugees in France seeking asylum. He develops partnerships with local churches, community groups, organizations, and local agencies, charities, etc. So the topic that we asked Braden to talk about is, he titled that Sentinels of Humanity at the Extreme Borders, Report on Humanitarian Actions in Calais, the case of Calais. So Braden, thank you very much for being available to talk with us and to share your experience and your activism with us. It's really important for us to have this activist dimension in our reflection on migration and solidarity and responsibilities. So please take the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jose, for that. I just want to say I'm grateful that this space of dialogue between Christians and the left, European left, Marxist, communists, that it exists. And I'm grateful for the things that the speakers shared. It was really interesting, giving me a lot to think about. I think most people, if they picture I've heard about Calais in the context of the big slum that was there in 2016 called the Jungle. But I mean, this happen, or people have been crossing this border to get to the UK in a larger context over the course of 30 years, or since the early 90s. So I think it's an interesting kind of case study or an example in how borders move and change and are kind of recede in an importance and become more enforced too. But just since 2016, there have been consistently migrants, refugees. I think for the purposes of this talk, I'll use the word, the name exiled people to include those who had to leave their homes for different reasons. So I think it's important to understand Calais as a symbolic city, as well as, I mean, it's a physical place on the map, but also being right in the middle between Paris, Brussels, and London, these major European capitals. What happens here is the direct result of policies that are policies of deterrence that are co-produced between the French government, the UK government, and the EU. And the topic is responsibilities. We see over and over again in pretty shocking ways how these governments fail in their responsibilities to people on the move, or to exiled people. So there's this winter, for example, there was 4,000 people that were sleeping outside in smaller camps, mostly between Calais and somewhere near Dunkirk, or just a half an hour north, called Lune Plage, near Grand Sainte, but just along the northern French coast. So the kind of the history, I mean, over the 30 years that people have been crossing, but especially since 2016, the French government has tried, the Interior Ministry has tried to have a policy of, they call it 0-point fixation, where they don't want anyone to ever establish anything like a permanent living site or permanent camp. So the way that that's manifest is in daily evictions or expulsions of these informal living sites, these camps. So there's not in Calais, there's not one big camp anymore. There's nothing that's administered by the government or by large NGOs. Instead, people are pushed to the exterior part of the city and invisibilized so that they, yeah, it's the times where people become more visible that the government responds even more strongly with over dramatized shows of force. So these evictions, each living site is evicted every 48 hours. So if you can imagine people that are living, with well, in very difficult conditions, in the, it rains a lot here, drops below zero in the winter time, in very unsanitary camps, because the municipality also refuses to take trash away. So there's I mean, there's children sleeping outside in places where there's rusted metal and rats, like really dangerous conditions, which is well, so the evictions are, I mean, if we talk about kind of solidarity actors and humanitarian actors, one great group is human rights observers who try to observe these evictions and record the police, and in hopes that there will be less violence, because these evictions are often accompanied with quite a bit of police violence, and also with people's personal property, their tents, sleeping bags, blankets, being thrown away, along with whatever personal, items that they might have, including phones or pieces of paper that have what little, contact information to stay in contact with family back home. So, and if they have documents that support their asylum claims, often they can be lost or destroyed in this process as well, or what little money they might have. So it's a place where people's human rights are being violated regularly. So around, well, Calais and Grand Sainte area, there are different associations that work together to address just trying to support, especially the survival needs of people, people on the move. So there's an association called Refugee Community Kitchen that cooks large amounts of hot food and distributes them multiple times per day. But along with this, there's always criminalization of solidarity, there's criminalization and intimidation. So during COVID, for example, the local government, along with the national government, they tried to limit or restrict where distributions could happen, including where people could get food. Eventually, they went to court, and they were fining the associations over and over, and large amounts of fines were building up. Eventually, a court ruled that this wasn't legal, and they had to return the fines. But there's also difficulties in access to water. The people have access to 10% of what the WHO says people need to live just healthy lives. So that's for drinking, but also for sanitary reasons. The French government does pay one association to distribute, food and water, but it's really dramatically insufficient for the needs of the people that are for exiled people that are stranded on this border. So in order to get to those places to get water, some people would have to walk over an hour there and back on a daily basis. You imagine, just people dealing with just their basic needs would take a lot of time and energy, which makes it more stressful, more traumatizing, and more difficult in their daily life. There's lots of different associations that all work together. Utopia 56, for example, will be kind of more emergency response, bringing people to the hospital when they need, or they'll be on the coast, driving in order to respond to people when they've had shipwrecks and are cold and wet and have at risk of experiencing hypothermia, to give them what little food or they have limited access to sleeping bags or blankets mostly. But there's different associations that all work together in under a network called the Platform of Support for Migrants, and we have inter-associational meetings every week. So that's kind of how the solidarity actors manifest their humanitarian action, trying to work together. There's different groups like Calais Food Collective that tries to give dry food so that people have the option to cook for themselves if they're far away from distribution points, or so that they can have the dignity and comfort that comes with cooking the food that is more familiar to their own cultures. There's also Woodyard, which during the coldest months tries to distribute firewood so that people can cook over that and to stay warm as well. And there's Refugee Women's Center that deals specifically with the needs of women and children, families who have particular needs. And then more recently, there's been Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. It's been present as well. Also, Secours Catholic, or Caritas in France, has a big day center where thousands of people will come to charge phones, to warm up, to try to wash clothes or get a shower, and have some limited access to legal advice too. So there's big big needs because the state isn't taking responsibility. Their effort is always to push people away from the border. They don't want people to be close in order to try. So they're always trying to push people to accommodation centers that are over an hour away, that they could stay for 2 weeks, but at the end they would have to try to claim asylum in France, which doesn't fit for many different people for many different reasons. For example, when people have family in the UK, just like we heard about with the EU policy, the UK has, well, in general, there are no safe routes from Europe, from France, for people to get to the UK to claim asylum. There are for Ukrainians, for people from Hong Kong, very limited things for Afghans, and but not from Europe. So if people are already here, their only option is to take yet another dangerous trip by small boat, and that's it's another thing that is one of the terrible realities here, is that very regularly, every couple of weeks, every few weeks, people are dying stranded on this border, both in shipwrecks, but also on land, being as they try to enter trucks, being hit by cars, people freeze inside of frozen 18-wheelers, lorries. People are electrocuted, trying to get onto trains on top of the Eurostar. People are hit by trains very, very often. And these are usually, very young people in their early 20s, both men and women, and sadly children as well. Just this year, there's been 10 people that have died. And at the beginning of the year, there was a group of 5 people that died. One was 14, another 16. Just 2 weeks ago, a little girl from Iraq named Rula, who was only 7 years old, drowned. And yeah, as we heard a bit in the last, well, as we heard earlier, for me, more and more, I'll say these are, I'll kind of give a little disclaimer that this is, so if I give an opinion, it's my opinion, and not doesn't reflect the Anglican Church necessarily. But just seeing the way that nature is used, I guess this is connected with like biopolitics and necropolitics, but the way that nature is kind of utilized to enforce immigration, but enforcing it through death, it really blurs the line between killing and letting die. So if we talk about responsibility, oftentimes the government is very quick, and both the governments of the UK and France are very quick to point their fingers at smugglers. And there are, horrible things that happen to people, horrible stories that I've heard of the way smugglers have abused people, but it's a more complicated story than that too, in that the environment that's, the smuggling is more a symptom rather than the cause. Or oftentimes in the UK, they're talking about breaking the smugglers or the human traffickers' business model, but that business model is created by the policies in place. These policies of France, the UK, and the EU. So I think that's one of the it's one of the hard things that I think that in order to better be responsible to each other, I think we have to face is that there are 2 different groups of people in this kind of necropolitics, or Achille Mbembe's idea of there's some people that are allowed to live and some people that must die. I mean, it sounds strong, but I mean, you watch the ferry that goes multiple times per day, and the people that travel through the tunnel, and the difference between people just being their country of origin, even though they have a right to claim asylum in the UK, they're being denied that right, and it has deadly consequences. Something that we've seen more and more in the last few years too is the UK government has been giving increasingly more money to the French government to implement these policies, deterrence. And the last one was over the course of 3 years, more than €500 million. And we're beginning to see the effects of that, unfortunately, that people are dying within sight of French shore or closer and closer to the beach because they're under more and more pressure to cross in more dangerous ways. So if more small boats are being intercepted, there are more, smugglers are putting more people in each boat. So the averages used to be, they used to be see maximums of 50, but now it's going as high as 70 in these very small boats that are not made for that. But also people are under pressure because they're being intercepted on days where the weather isn't very good at the beach by money that's coming from the UK, from France, by more policing. But that policing just puts more pressure on people to go before boats are inflated completely. Or, the police will come and they'll tear gas people often. There's been cases last year where that was the last interaction two people had with anyone outside the boat that they were in, was to be tear gassed. But they'll come and they'll take a knife and puncture the boats. But the pressure, you can imagine, it causes people to leave even more quickly. And that can have deadly results, that people are dying in a way we can imagine the border, it's this line in the middle of the channel between France and the UK. But for me, that's how I understand the border even moving to the part where the shore is between the land and sea. But of course, people on a daily basis have their movement restricted and stopped inland as well. So yeah, it creates this kind of space that's often becomes a kind of lawless space as well, where the French don't respect even their own laws, or where shocking things like police taking away people's shoes and making them walk out, all through the night, kilometers and kilometers. I've witnessed pretty shocking examples of racism on the train, for example, where the representative of SNCF, or the National Train Service, will go and pick people based on, I assume, their black faces or looking like they're from the Middle East, and ask for their tickets, and say incredibly racist or overtly racist things. And there's been talk recently, the buses in Calais are free, but there's a move in local politics to make them free for everyone, but not for migrants. And there's also been reports of migrants being forced to sit on the back of the bus. And also we've had people, so I'm connected with a house of hospitality called Maria Skopsova Catholic Worker House, and there's been people that have come back with numbers written on them, that the police have written numbers on people's hands. It's pictures that you can see where these are kind of just the examples of how these policies, often we talk about dehumanization, but a lot of times I'm wondering if exiled people are really losing any of their humanity. I think they're being treated less than human often, but for me, I like this concept of Ubuntu, which is it's a word in a lot of Southern African languages. In South Africa, in the fight against apartheid, it was very important. But the idea of collective humanity, or I am because you are, and in that, I think if we oppress someone else, we oppress ourselves, we hurt ourselves. So for me, if we talk about, sentinels of humanity, I was thinking, I think we have to be careful with our humanity. I'm working for a church, but my faith is important to me, and I think that for me, if people are created in the image of God and we're treating them less than that, it says more about us and more damage to our own humanity. I wanted to take just a little time, if I could. So I've been mostly connected to Maria Skoptsova House of Hospitality. It's a Catholic worker house, or house in the Catholic worker movement. So I've been connected with different houses of hospitality, but this is the one. It's a community I really love. It's a place where there's a lot of beauty and a lot of hope, but also the people that are welcome there are often experiencing things that, more harsh realities that we don't always see. But this house is it's inspired by two women, and I think for the purposes of this dialogue between Christians and those on the left, I think these two people could be very interesting if people have heard about them, or if I think they'd be interesting to look into. So one is that the person the house is named after, Maria Skoptsova, Mother Maria of Paris, who she so both her and the other woman I'll talk about, Dorothy Day, who's one of the co-founders of the Catholic worker movement, they both had their start in being engaged in solidarity in connection with as communists with other communists, and then later in life came to religious life, the faith, and I think they could both be interesting in that they both lived their lives in this space in which we're having a dialogue between the left and the church, and continued to be anti-capitalist, continued to be anti-fascist in their actions and in the way that they lived their lives, and something happened in a special way in the church. So both of them. Oddly enough, had a connection to, so Maria Skoptsova she lived in Russia during the time of the revolution, and so she actually she at one point she was so angry with Tolstoy for disbanding the Socialist Revolutionary Party Congress that she wanted to assassinate him, and was talked out of it by other friends. So that kind of gives a picture of her at this moment of her life. And later, after the Bolsheviks came to power in 1918, she was actually elected to be a deputy mayor of a town, Anapa in Russia. But then, as the White Army came in, the mayor fled, and she became the mayor. So this kind of gives a bit of a picture. But the other connection to Tolstoy, for Dorothy Day, she actually interviewed him when he was in exile in North America, and when he came to New York. But just to give a little picture, but both of them wound up opening houses of hospitality, or this was their way of taking responsibility, to be responsible for our brothers and sisters, for each other. And I think for me, I think that it's just an interesting way as I try to understand. A lot of times in the associations in Calais, we talk about wanting the government to take responsibility, or not wanting to replace the government in the actions that we take. But I think it raises a lot of questions of. We talk about not wanting to replace the government, for accommodation, for feeding people, for providing water, that the government should be doing these things. But at the same time, we know that it won't happen, at least anytime soon. So for me, I guess understanding what I want to be as a Catholic worker, as part of this Catholic worker movement, is thinking, how can we well, they talk about building a new society in the shell of the old, or trying to create something too. And I think that's how I understand this solidarity action and humanitarian action, even between these different houses of hospitality that we have in Calais, trying to be connected to each other. But then, yeah, there's an important idea of personalism in this movement where, so this is just a quote. I think it's a quote from Dorothy Day, but she took it from Dostoevsky. For know, dear ones, that every one of us is undoubtedly responsible for all men, not merely through the general sinfulness of creation, but each one personally for all mankind and every individual man. So I guess how I understand that is, I think it's good. I mean, that we should call for on a political level for things to change, to actually value the life of each child above, well, hoarding wealth. I think is how I understand what's happening in this reaction to, I mean, I think people have a scarcity mindset in this reaction to making borders stronger and costing people's lives rather than allowing them the opportunities to just come and to have free movement and to live where they choose to live. But yeah, for me, I have this question inside of myself a bit, like how can this change? How can this transformation come? And I think we need to act personally, and it's what I see. It's the encouraging thing that I see in Calais, amidst a lot of suffering that is caused by these policies. That the more people build these personal links of trying to be responsible to each other, I think for me that's how our society will be transformed. That's what I hope. But I think that's yeah, I think it's 5 o'clock, so maybe my time is up. But thank you so much for listening and for the invitation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Brandon, for your testimony and for bringing together this these examples from your everyday activism, not only in Calais, but namely in Calais, together with your, I would say, personal dilemmas, for sharing with us your personal dilemmas, which in fact I believe are also ours, at least from those of us that are involved in the dialogue experience of dialogue between different cultures, namely left-oriented one and Christian. So thank you very much indeed. And also for bringing for our reflection, examples like the one of Dorothy Day and Maria Skolowska, etc. So it was really great. Thank you so much. And I do believe that lots of people have questions and comments. So please use the chat for that purpose. So far, I don't think we have anything, but a million of them will explode in a minute, I'm certain. Who wants to begin this phase of a question and answer? Yeah, well, I was reminding, listening to you, I was reminding one of the concepts that has struck me most in dealing with the experience of refugee people and of displaced people in the Second World War, which was Hannah Arendt's concept of superfluous people. She called those multitudes of people fleeing from their places and without any kind of safeguard from any national state. She called them superfluous people. And the portrait that you presented from Calais, and which is obviously can be multiplied in different other places of contemporary Europe, uh, brings us to our mind this experience of people that don't have any kind of defensive mechanisms. They don't have any sort of instance that assures basic rights, minimum existential rights, whatever the name we give to those rights. And in fact, this idea of superfluous people, people that can be, discarded, is also at the heart of Pope Francis, words and reasoning about refugees and about, it is precisely this culture of discarding people, of discarding, superfluous people. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on this, on the impact that this condition of being superfluous has on churches on the one side, namely local churches, of course, which are closer to that experience, but also on other forms of other origins of activism. Because most of the times, this is my personal reflection, activism is based on categories and not on lives. It's based on concepts and not on concrete experiences, concrete forms of suffering. So I wonder if you could, having in mind your own experience in Calais and perhaps in other parts of the world, if you could elaborate a little bit more. I know that we have already more questions. Let me just read because it will be useful. Let me just try to assure that I'm not putting anything aside. Yeah, well, oh, yeah, from Katerina. Perhaps it's easier to speak than write in this case. I would like to share my thoughts on solidarity versus charity in the field and perhaps steer an exchange there. Okay, so great. Katerina, I will give you the floor in a minute. And then Luisa says, it's very impressive what you said. Is there any way to put this discrimination more in the public mediatical opinion? How can we bring this to the mediascape, if you can say so? So these are the first questions, please. Brethren, take the floor. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing you talked about, Jose, I think it gets to the heart of what I feel like I've understood more deeply over the last few years of living in Calais and trying to be in solidarity with people. And I think especially as Christians, like, and I would assume most of the Marxists would agree too, that there are no superfluous people. I mean, that the difficulty, and I think, is when we kind of accept as normal that, yeah, some people can be discarded, or that it is normal that, I guess this is where I mean, I'm not a scholar, and I think I don't, I'm only just beginning to understand a little bit this idea of biopolitics and necropolitics, but it's really been something for the past, I think, 6 months I can't get out of my head, because we see it here, that I mean, Achille Mbembe talks about the living dead, that some people are put into a category where they're not allowed to live their lives as fully as the rest of us, and in that process, I mean, there are the people that are dying in increasing numbers each year, because of security. I mean, we have to ask the question, security for who? Because it's not for the most vulnerable people. It seems to be security for those in power. It's security for, accumulated wealth. But I think, for me, it's something that I really hope the church would speak to, and speak to more, speak out against, For me, that's what I love about like the spirituality of Maria Skoptsova is yeah, seeing people as icons of God, seeing their value as as Jesus too. I mean, for us, I think Jesus was discarded or was killed by the state as well. And Maria Skoptsova herself, she wound up dying in Ravensbrück after yeah, doing what she could to protect the lives of Jewish people during World War II, as you're talking about this example. And I think yeah, I think that resistance, I mean, I kind of in the Catholic worker movement, I think it's very important to me. It's non-violent resistance, but I think we have an obligation to resist this kind of discarding of people's lives or treating people like they're superfluous, because yeah, I mean, how will future generations look back at us? I mean, we look back at the Holocaust and we think things are very, very clear, but if we're not willing to stand in solidarity with each other now, kind of think sometimes Jesus talking about what, you know, if this is what we do when the leaf is green, what do we do when it's brown? Or what happens when there's more criminalization of solidarity or where there's more crackdown? I mean, already sometimes the associations here will get accused of being as bad as smugglers or being responsible for people's deaths. The government will be very quick to point the blame first at smugglers and then at people that are standing in solidarity. But I think for me that's the question: is can we build unity and connections and structures in order to resist the the government has a different motivation than protecting these people. They have other.
And how can this be brought to the mediascape, as Luisa asked?
Yeah, that's one of the big questions I have now. Because even in the people that are dying, oftentimes there's very little reporting on it, unless people die in very big numbers. Like 3 years ago, well, minimum 27, but much more like 30 people died in one shipwreck in the English Channel, or when there's so 6 Afghans that died last summer, or I mean, if people die in high enough numbers, it can get people's attention for a short period of time, but it's a sad reality that the majority of people, as they die in ones and twos, there's no media coverage, unless, yeah, like Rula, like the victim is particularly young, or a child. So I think it's for us to use whatever connections we have and to talk about, I mean, to not avoid looking at these harsh realities, and to talk to each other. But I mean, we try to, I mean, it's complicated to have journalists. Sometimes there are journalists that come to Calais. We try to have, I mean, we don't want to just be doing palliative care or to be just, like pulling people out of the river downstream, but to ask why people are following in. So I mean, I think it's important to ask these political questions too. But that's what I'm hoping with the Anglican Church, to use networks of these kind of platforms that the church has. I'm hoping that they'll be used in order to make people aware of how people are being treated in their lives and in their deaths.
Right. There are 2 more questions, and we are running out of time.
Yeah.
Because in 3 minutes we'll have to move to the groups. So let me just pose read the 2 final questions. The first comes from Claudia, and she asks, even if you know about this situation, it leaves you shocked and speechless to know that this is the current state of our democracy and our constitutional state. She says state, but states. Hope, which is not the same as optimism, can only arise through our collective activity. So this is a comment. Perhaps you can give some echoes about this. And finally, the last question comes from, I believe it was from Luisa, but I'm not sure. And she says, which non-religious groups are working for the refugees in Calais? So very objective questions. Which non-religious groups are working for refugees in Calais? are there also Muslim aid organizations active there? So if you can answer this, we would appreciate.
Yeah, so the majority, almost all of the associations that I mentioned are non-religious in their nature. There's very few. So Secor Catholic has roots like Caritas Catholic roots. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a question sometimes whether they're religious or not. I mean, they're both people operating the salary. People that work there are not religious, but they're, people from the parish who have been engaged for decades sometimes. And yeah, like Maria Skopsova House is a Christian community that welcomes, but there are other houses that are non-religious. So the majority are non-religious non-religious groups. I think this contrast between optimism and hope, I think, is important too, because I think it's also a bit of the trouble in trying to have contact with the media, and a lot of times people don't. I think people want to jump right away to a feel-good story sometimes, or to see the positive thing. But I think the important thing is first to look at the reality, and then we have to go through sometimes a process of grief, and then on the other side, I think there can be hope. Or like for me, I think it's in our faith. Yeah, I think that it's important to not jump to a false hope, but there are lots of reasons to be hopeful, but first we have to be willing to look at the reality, not look away.
Well, thank you very, very much, Braden, for this very, very insightful sharing of your experience, of your reflection. It was really important for all of us, I am certain. And also because facing the gigantic dimension of the challenge that you face every day in Calais and other Calais of the world, the dialogue between different cultures or different approaches to responding suffering, like the dialogue between Marxism and Christianity, is not only natural, but something that is demanded by reality. So thank you really very much. I think that we now move to Ana Clara, whom I would ask to explain how this next moments will be organized. So Ana Clara, please, if you can explain us.
Yes. So thank you, Braden, for your sharing, your insights, and your experience. Right now, we are having our dialogue groups. We are now around 30 people here. So we will have 3 groups for Italian speakers and 3 groups for English speakers. I will share with you the questions. So these are the 3 questions that we are going to answer and share and discuss on our groups. The first one, what should the EU consider more in its policies? How can European citizens be prepared for the increasing flows? And what kind of experiences do you have in relation with migrants, refugees? So as I said in the beginning, this webinar is part of the Dialogue Project, and it's an opportunity for this group of dialogue between Christians and Marxists to write documents to the European Union. So this moment of sharing and discussing, it's important for us to have your ideas, your feelings, and also your desires to voice out towards the European Union. So what we ask you is that in each group, one person is responsible to take notes, and then this person can share the notes in the chat when we come back. We will have more or less 35 minutes for this moment. And so I will open the rooms now, and you will see in your screen, and you can choose Italian, or English. The rooms are open now. Let's try to have from 5 to 6 people in each room. So I ask you to choose. The rooms are open in your screen now. Let's try to have from 5 people in each room, so you can choose Italian or English. We have already one group with 3 people for Italian, one group with 2 people for Italian. If you have difficulties into joining the groups, let me know in the chat. I can add you, I can assign you to the group. I see some people still. Okay, Canto, I will assign you. Do you want Italian or English? If you don't see the groups, maybe you can see down in your screen breakout rooms, but I can assign some people as well.
from the statements of our guests, and I have, as I said, 4 elements. The first is that, for what I realize, that the dominant contemporary answers to migrations are necropolitics and ruination. And as Katarina was just saying, this has a basis on colonial continuities. Masses of people on the move are treated as superfluous people, to whom any basic right is denied, sort of, to use the words of Breton, masses of living deaths. Second point, I'm quoting different statements of this afternoon. Borders don't come from God. They are constructed, they are destroyed, and they are reconstructed by concrete people. But we live in a time in which the bordering practices are not anymore confined to the territorial limits of nation states. Those bordering practices are coming in the states, in the countries, in a sort of boomerang effect, and mobilize racial, class, gender, religious identities to hierarchize, to include and exclude, to humanize and dehumanize. The third topic, which I think has been very much present in this afternoon's work, is the following. The concrete EU policies for migration are, to say the least, contradictory. On the one side, there has been a search for common or shared regulation. But on the other side, and simultaneously, there is an everyday practice of securitization of production of root causes for forced migration and of regressful, fearful practices like pushbacks, as externalization, datafication, etc. And finally, the fourth point is based on Gramsci's dualism between the pessimism of reason and the optimism of the will, as has been quoted by Professor Khosravi. As citizens, as activists, as intellectuals, as Marxists, as Christians, we are challenged to produce knowledge about migrations that is committed to serve the transformation and the humanization of this reality, to turn dehumanization into solidarity, and to produce knowledge about migration reality is the way, or one way, for us to contribute to this transformation. So, quoting Judith Kohlenberger, I would say that present empirical data, critically expose the dominant narratives, contextualize and undermine and refuse the undermine of complexity, to dispute the hegemony of the culture of discard with a culture and with a practice of hope and of solidarity is what is at the reach of our hands and of our reasoning to for us to contribute to the transformation of this reality. I think, at least for me, these were 4 lines of reasoning that were most impressive in this afternoon's work, which I believe was splendid and was extremely rich. And I want to share with you my deep satisfaction with this circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you, José. And I think we see each other tomorrow. Please share also with those you think would like to be here. I can send in the chat right now the link for tomorrow. We will start at 9 a.m. and we will be here until 1 p.m. So if you want, please, and you like today, share also with other people who would be happy to join us tomorrow. And yeah, a lot to expect. Right, José? Yes, thank you.
Absolutely,
Have a
absolutely.
good night. Have a good evening and see you
Bye-bye.
tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Ciao. Ciao.